Welcome back to the Law and Crime Network, everybody. I'm Aaron Keller. I'll be with you for the afternoon, as I am almost every single day. We're cutting in to announce that the jury apparently has reached a verdict in the Adam Matos case out of Florida. Matos, the defendant, facing 4 counts of first-degree murder, that's what the prosecution has charged him with, related to the deaths of his former girlfriend and the mother of his child, Megan Brown, her father, Gregory Brown, her stepmother, Margaret Brown, and Nick Leonard, who is said to have been Megan's new boyfriend. Very widely different versions of this crime have been put forward by both the prosecution and the defense. And in closing arguments yesterday, the defense was relatively clear that this probably can in no way be a not guilty verdict. The question primarily is whether or not the killings, which the defendant admitted to on the witness stand, were somehow justified because the defendant said that he believed he was being attacked first. The defendant seemed to think this was a trap that some of the victims had set for him, claiming that Nick Leonard came out of a closet. We know that Nick had brought his own gun into the house, and this commotion ensued. So that's the question the jury really has to face. I did a quick piece on lawandcrime.com that lays out the different charges that the jury had to consider. It looks like they went through things very, very quickly because they got the case this morning after jury instructions. But the bottom line is this. Under that top charge of first-degree murder, the jury also could consider lesser-included offenses. In this case, those lesser-included offenses were second-degree murder, manslaughter, and then, of course, the justifiable homicide, which is one of the theories that the defense was pushing. We are waiting for things to pick up in court, so while we wait for that to happen, wait for this process to unravel, wait for family members to come back in the courtroom, wait for the defendant, the attorneys to come back into the courtroom, etc. While we're waiting for that, I'll start walking through some of these different charges that the jury has been deliberating for a matter of only a couple of hours in Florida. First-degree murder, the top charge, that's what the state pushed against the defendant as to all 4 of the victims. That charge requires premeditation. Now, we know from almost every single trial that we cover here that involves first-degree murder or in its analogy in another state, that charge, or that premeditation rather, can be very, very slight, or it can be lengthy. It can be a plan that takes weeks or longer, or it could be a few seconds. It's up to the jury to decide whether or not premeditation existed. And in this case, the state at least thinks that it did. The state's theory, or one of the state's theories, is that Adam Matos, the defendant, started to think about killing each of the 4 victims after the 911 call to report a domestic disturbance between victim Megan Brown and Adam Matos on the morning of August 28th. That's when the state says he left, that he started to stew about things, and then started to hatch plans to do harm to the victims. In the alternate, the state also says that the defendant admitted to first-degree murder with the way that he killed at least some of the victims, including Nick Leonard. Well, we know Nick Leonard is the one who introduced what's believed to be the murder weapon into the home because the caliber of the weapon's shells match up with the bullets that were found and fired into 2 of the victims' bodies. So that's a hard fact for the state to get over because it at least suggests that there was some kind of a fight between Leonard and the defendant. But here's the thing. The defendant, when he was on the stand, said, okay, yeah, I was defending myself from Nick Leonard, but I stabbed him and then later went back and beat him to death. Well, in that time that elapsed, the state said, look, that's enough for first-degree murder because you injured him and then you formed the premeditated plan to go and beat him to death. That's enough for first-degree murder. And the state argued, I think rather successfully, that even if we take the defendant at his word on the stand, he may have admitted to first-degree murder in that instance with Nick Leonard. The death of Margaret Brown, the stepmother to Megan Brown, that also could be seen as first-degree murder. The defense tried to say, no, it might be a top charge of second-degree murder, something like that, but we'll have to see how the jury separated that all out. Now, second-degree murder, that's the next charge down the line that the jury could consider. In Florida, second-degree murder generally means that the victim and the defendant had some kind of pre-existing relationship with underlying elements of hostility. That puts it into plain English. There are all these other little words like depraved mind and imminently dangerous in the wording of it, but ultimately second-degree murder is a pretty heinous act that doesn't carry an element of premeditation. The jury could have gone there with a couple of the charges. What looks like family members are starting to filter into the courtroom. This has been a very short deliberation. If I were to guess, I would say that the jury has reached first-degree murder on at least one, if not all, of the 4 counts related to the 4 victims based on the timeline here. Because look, the jury just got the case. The jury also had lunch, presumably, and the jury was instructed to start with the top charge, first-degree murder, and then if the jury didn't agree with that charge, the jury had to filter down through all of the other charges. Given that instruction, if the jury followed it, and they probably did, this seems like a very quick verdict for this to be anything other than first-degree murder, if not at a minimum as to one of the victims, to many of them, if not all of them. That's my prediction based on the timeline. We'll have to wait and see how this plays out. Now, the jury could also consider a manslaughter charge. That's just a killing of a person without legal justification. It doesn't require premeditation. It doesn't require this underlying hostility in a relationship between people who knew one another. It's almost the default charge, and this defense brought that up during closing arguments yesterday. Now, the jury was also instructed to consider justifiable homicide. That's in instance as the defense alleged happened here, where a killer had reason to kill. An example would be to defend oneself against a deadly threat. And the defense really tried to turn this into something that sounded an awful lot like a stand your ground case. We know that those cases have exploded in Florida since the passage of the stand your ground law. So that's a really critical element of what the jury may have been back and forth with here. Ultimately, they really needed to settle that out. If they wanted to go there, they could say, hey, well, maybe the killing of at least one of these folks was justifiable because, bottom line, there's evidence that there was some kind of a scuffle or an attack. How did the gun get from Nick Leonard into the hands of Adam Matos? That is the hardest fact that the state had to try to get over in this case. And if the defense made some headway with its theory, my guess would be it probably would be that. I don't know if I necessarily buy it, but that could be a theory, that could be something that the jury had to consider. Of course, the jury could also consider not guilty, but that seems very unlikely, even in the defense's own version of this case. So, I've got the piece up on Law and Crime right now if you want to take a quick peek at it. Not a lot of time to digest it because a verdict is in the Adam Matos case in Florida. You're looking at the courtroom live as family members start to filter in. We're probably going to see the defendant coming in very, very shortly. The attorney's up at the bench right now talking with the judge, presumably just laying out some procedural matters. If this is a guilty verdict on first-degree murder, then bottom line, this is going to move into a penalty phase, and we believe that will probably start next week if we're understanding the timeline. That's if they have to go there. Ronn Blitzer from lawandcrime.com is with me in the studio now. Ron, good to see you. What do you think if you were to take a guess on this one?
If I had to guess, I would say first-degree murder when it comes to all of the victims here. I think that Matos' defense was rather weak. I think even if you believe his side of the story, it's still not justifiable homicide or self-defense or anything warranting not guilty. At the very least, I could see him potentially getting just manslaughter for maybe 1 or 2, but I think even that is unlikely.
It seems very unlikely to me as well. And I was saying before you came in, Ron, look at the timeline here of the deliberations. They have to start with that top charge, the first-degree murder, and if they can't agree on it, they start moving down the list. Well, this jury has only had the case for a couple of hours. So it would seem to me that they went back there, had some lunch, said, let's check guilty across the board. And look, I could be wrong, but there's not been a lot of time to filter this down through the other charges.
Oh, absolutely. To go through the kind of legal analysis warranted to really look at the nuances of the different charges, or at least to go through that first charge and say, oh, we're not really comfortable with this, so let's then move down the line and have a whole separate discussion. That seemed to be, as you were saying, a little more time-consuming than we think that they would have had time for.
Now, yesterday I was tweeting like crazy into the evening because the closing arguments went rather late. A couple of the key points that I picked up on in the state's rebuttal. One is this one. The state said that the shot to Megan Brown's face, she was shot and killed right through the left eye, just gruesome. The state said, look, this shows some serious person-to-person contact. Now, it doesn't necessarily per se scream first-degree murder on its own, but second degree, given the closeness of the relationship between the two, it would seem like it could be that.
Absolutely. And when you look at what his excuse was when it comes to her, he didn't give any sort of evidence that she was trying to kill him. With Nick Leonard or the Gregory Brown, he gave stories about how they were actively trying to kill him. But with her, he didn't even go that far. He just said, oh, well, she was there too, so I thought that she was going to try to kill me too, so I killed her.
Exactly. Now, look, this household, okay, where the Browns moved to Florida to be closer to ultimately Greg's parents, Megan's grandparents, they go down there, they start renting this place from an acquaintance that they had in Pennsylvania, because they all lived in Pennsylvania right up until less than 2 months before this quadruple murder. They bring Adam Matos down with them so that he can remain in the life of the child, Tristan, who was 4 years old when the murders were committed. Look, I suspect, based on the depositions, based on what we've heard in court, that this house was uneasy, to say the least. But does the defendant get anywhere by saying, oh, I thought that they were all out to get me, I thought there was this plot to kill me? It just doesn't line up to me.
It doesn't line up, and not only that, if you listen to what he's saying, even if you believe his side of the story, I think you still have to find him guilty of first-degree murder of Nick Leonard. Because remember, first he says that Leonard had the gun and initiated this and there was this violent struggle, but then Leonard was out. And it wasn't until after he says he killed Greg Brown and after he killed Megan that he was then so upset and angry that he then took his anger out on Nick Leonard by hitting him with a hammer over and over again until he couldn't hit him anymore. So that is not a case of fearing for your life. The guy's already out, and then you're going to start hitting him with a hammer and killing him. That's first-degree murder.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, as the state put it in the rebuttal and in the closing, he admitted to first-degree murder with his own version of things, because the walking away from Nick Leonard and then the going back, that's enough time to form premeditation.
Exactly.
So, I mean, look, that did more damage than good. But, I think the worst fact in this thing from the get-go was that it appears that Nick Leonard's weapon ultimately was used to murder Greg and Megan. So the theory goes that Nick comes over to try to help protect people. Okay, we know Greg had his own weapons, but we also know he had a very, very bad back. He had had back surgery. He was on disability. So even though he had weapons, if there was trouble there, could he truly have defended everyone? And I think that the medical evidence would suggest, well, no, Greg Brown wasn't going to chase Adam Matos around if he showed back up and started causing trouble. And keep in mind, there had been trouble before that Greg had to get in the middle of and separate Matos from Megan. So we know that there was tension there. We know that there was tension that morning. We know the police were called. My gut is that the state has that part of the theory right, that Megan calls up her new friend, Nick Leonard, says, we need some protection. Police didn't arrest this guy. Come on over. The big question mark is, how does Matos get the gun? That part of it is just the worst fact for the state. And I don't know, do we believe Matos' version of the story? Do we believe some part of Matos' version of the story? Do we not believe it at all? But somehow the gun goes from Nick Leonard to this defendant. And that's tough for the state to get over.
It is tough, and if Matos' version of the story was that he killed Nick Leonard during that initial scuffle, then I could see him being found not guilty, or maybe at least manslaughter when it comes to that. But as we were just saying, he didn't kill Leonard until later on, after that initial scuffle. So the fact that the gun wasn't the murder weapon for him and that the hammer was involved as well, that helps the prosecution a lot and I think would help them recover from that weakness.
Yeah, and and it raises just such a big factual what if question here, and it may be one of these cases that we'll never know exactly what went down because the prosecution ultimately landed on the theory that Matos snuck into the garage when Margaret returned home from work. She left work at around 11:10 p.m. would have come back home about 15 minutes later, so she was back about 11:25. You've got the passerby hearing gunshots in the area around 11:45. The state's theory is that Margaret was killed first in the garage and then Matos goes upstairs, and that somewhere in that scuffle the other two are killed. And one of the crime scene reconstructionists who consulted for the defense but ultimately was not called as a witness said in a pretrial deposition that Megan and her father were killed in the master bedroom and that Nick was killed in one of the other bedrooms. Now, I sat here yesterday, sat on the train on the way home yesterday and tried to come up with a couple of scenarios, and I don't know if I completely agree with either version of it, but I don't know if I buy this defendant's version of it at all. This whole thing that Greg Brown, who had experience with weapons, his gun jams twice. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I buy that, even though the gun was later found with a bullet in the chamber. Maybe he was in the process of trying to defend himself, but Matos claiming, well, it's just by luck that I happen to be standing here because the father tried to shoot me twice and the gun jammed both times. I don't know. If someone who's experienced with weapons, I mean, I guess it could happen. It just doesn't make a lot of sense.
It is unlikely. If you want to buy the story, I still don't think it's enough to get him off for that, but I don't buy it personally. But then on top of that, see, here's the thing. You have 4 different victims here, and if he gets hit with first-degree murder for any of them, he's in big trouble. And what's his defense for killing Margaret Brown? He really didn't have any. Just, everyone else was trying to kill me, so I assumed she was too. That one, I think he has the biggest problem with.
Yeah, look, we've got a lot of different theories in this case. The bottom line is that it just doesn't look good that these 4 were killed. The defendant admits at his own hand. And look, yeah, he doesn't try to flee, and the defense is trying to paint him as a saint because, he didn't really do anything wrong with self-defense. But look, why is he hanging around? Why isn't he reporting that the thing happened? And in this whole story, he feared that the police were going to shoot him and kill him. Well, look, the guy had a previous record. He had a lot of interaction with the police. They didn't shoot him and kill him up in Pennsylvania any of the times he was breaking and entering into former girlfriends' places. They didn't shoot him and kill him when he was out on this burglary or robbery spree, I forget which, where he made off with tens of thousands of dollars worth of property. He had been in and out of the system since he was in school. Okay, so all of a sudden to just fear that the police are going to try to take him out doesn't make a lot of sense.
Yeah,
they showed restraint before with him.
Yeah, it's not like he's unaware of how police would respond to something like this. It's not like he doesn't know how things work around there. He, as you said, has plenty of experience with cops who are trying to get him, and they didn't try to kill him.
Yeah, we've got the defendant in the courtroom right now waiting to see exactly where things are going to go. The jury is not yet in the courtroom. It looks like the attorneys are there. The family appears to have been there. So we're going to have a verdict any time in the Adam Matos case out of Florida. The defendant facing 4 first-degree murder charges. Those are the top charges. They all require premeditation. If convicted of any of the first-degree murder charges with relation to any of the victims, this trial will move to a second phase. The defendant will either face life in prison or the death penalty. That's if convicted. So we're waiting to see exactly where the jury comes back. The family apparently is not all the way into the courtroom. I thought I saw some of them walk in earlier. We have a few of them just starting to come in now, so not everyone was present yet. Oftentimes this is the case. There's an announcement of a verdict and people have to come shuffling back into the courtroom to listen to the proceedings, and certainly they have every right to be there. They want to know what happened. Ron, we've had a lot of back and forth here. We had the defense get up there yesterday and basically try to lay out why the lesser includeds were the better charges in this case and not the top charge, at least not as to all of the victims. If this jury comes back and says second-degree murder for everybody, this defense team will be popping champagne corks at the end of the day. It seems rather unlikely to me, but I've seen stranger things happen. That would be a big change. If this jury comes back with manslaughter, saying that they agree this is just a crime of passion, this house was a pressure cooker, it finally exploded, well, under Florida law, that fits manslaughter more than first or second degree murder.
If you're the defense, if you get anything other than first degree murder, this is a big win. This is a very strong case for the prosecution, with some weaknesses as we've mentioned, but the case is so overwhelming in their favor and against Matos that I would be very surprised by anything other than first degree murder, so anything less is a victory for the defense.
We are still waiting to see exactly how long this is going to take for everything to get squared away here. We might have some action right now. It looks like the judge is starting to address the courtroom, so let's go there live.